If you grew up before the HD era, there's probably a game from your childhood that lingered in your imagination for years, despite having simple graphics. For me, one of those games is Halo Combat Evolved. Halo wasn't the first game I ever played, but it was the first game that actually immersed me in its world. Every detail from its dormant alien structures, desolate landscapes, impossibly tall cliffs, and iconic enemies pulled me in like no game ever had previously. And it was a feeling that stuck with me long after I put down the controller. Maybe you grew up playing Zelda, Banjo Kazooie, or exploring the dreamlike worlds of Super Mario 64, worlds that somehow felt a lot bigger than they actually were. By today's standards, those games look primitive. They're low poly, low resolution, full of sharp edges and muddy textures, and yet they just felt right. They stuck with us, and decades later, we're still talking about them with genuine reverence. So what's going on here? Why do we remember the foggy streets of Silent Hill or the vast plains of Shadow of the Colossus more vividly than many modern photorealistic games? Some of you will say it's just nostalgia, but maybe there's something deeper happening here, something about how our brains actually work, or about how good design thrives under constraint. Many of these older low-poly games achieved greater artistic clarity and emotional impact because technical limitations forced developers to focus on what actually mattered. And when developers got the fundamentals right, their games became timeless, despite all their imperfections. And believe it or not, those missing details, well, they're not quite as important as you might think. Before we get into it, let's quickly define some terms. Low poly refers to 3D models built with a small number of polygons. Think simple shapes, flat surfaces, and minimal detail. And low fidelity describes an art style that intentionally avoids complex geometry and hyper-realistic detail, focusing instead on things like readability and artistic expression. To keep things simple, I'll use low poly throughout this video to refer to both of these things. Okay, so I said the details are not as important as you might think. And why is that? Well, our brains are actually wired to fill in missing information by turning the abstract into something complete, recognizable, and real. When you look at an image, your brain doesn't just passively receive information, it also constructs it. Your vision doesn't work by simply capturing an image like a camera, it's also a predictive engine, constantly filling in the blanks while it collects more information. This is why low poly games can feel so rich and immersive despite their lack of detail. They leave space for your brain to fill in the gaps. And there's actually a name for this, and it's more than just a scary sounding German word. Gestalt psychology explains how we tend to perceive whole images rather than their disconnected parts. When we see shapes, our brains instinctively organize them into meaningful patterns. This is why a cluster of simple polygons can become a warthog, or why a foggy outline in Silent Hill feels more terrifying than it should. Modern neuroscience backs this up too. Predictive processing theory, described by Barr et al. In a 2007 paper, suggests that, quote, a fundamental function of the brain is to predict proximate events, which facilitates interactions with external stimuli. The paper continues, stating, quote, the efficiency of vision arises from the integration of two interacting and cooperating mechanisms. A fast and coarse subsystem that initiates top-down predictions based on partially processed visual input, and a slower, finer subsystem that is guided by the rapidly activated predictions and refines them based on slower arriving, detailed information. In other words, your mind doesn't wait to gather every visual detail before it starts interpreting an image. It anticipates some of the details and fills in the gaps, utilizing its experiential knowledge to create continuity. We don't just see what's there, we see a cohesive image even when we don't have all the information. Low poly art leverages this phenomenon beautifully. The simplicity gives your brain room to breathe, to imagine, or to co-create, if you will. There's also something called cognitive load, which states that the human brain can only process a certain amount of information at once. Imagine trying to memorize an entire textbook the night before an exam. It's too much information too quickly. In the context of gaming, if every surface is covered with busy textures, reflections, and fine details, in addition to particle effects, dynamic lighting, color, movement, and a whole host of other visual artifacts, your brain struggles to keep up with all the detail. But when a game pares down to its most essential forms, it reduces the cognitive load and the world becomes easier to read and understand. And here's the kicker. Your memory actually favors the overall feeling or the essence of an experience rather than the details. That is to say, you are far more likely to remember how something made you feel than you are the particulars of what it looked like. That doesn't mean graphics don't matter. It just means that clear, readable scenes are more likely to elicit an emotional response than busy, cluttered images. A minimalist environment like the thick fog in Silent Hill or the vast plains of Shadow of the Colossus lingers in your memory because your brain helped create it and the experience was emotionally significant. While high-fidelity graphics aim to simulate reality, low-poly worlds do something a bit more subtle. They invite you to fill in the blanks. What you see is only part of the experience. The rest lives in your imagination. So if our brains actually enjoy filling in what's missing, less detail isn't a flaw, it's a design principle. Good design isn't about how much you can add, it's about how much you can remove without losing meaning. The legendary industrial designer Dieter Rams put it simply, quote, "Good design is as little design as possible, less but better." Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said it another way, quote, "Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away." William Lidwell described it thusly, quote, "Every element in a design should be expressed to the extent necessary, but not beyond the extent necessary. Excess is noise." Even Shakespeare agreed with this sentiment, famously saying, "Brevity is the soul of wit." These men may have been industrial designers, writers, engineers, and playwrights, but they offer some valuable insight into good design principles that remain applicable to video games, namely that excess distracts from or obfuscates good design. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, described the process of creating Super Mario 64 as, quote, "sculpting a diorama out of clay, starting first with a very general and simple shape. Every object and character was designed to be instantly recognizable, even from a distance or in motion. This approach aligns with a design principle called silhouette theory. If you can easily recognize a character or an object just from its outline, you've got a good design. A strong silhouette is important because the brain processes broad shapes more efficiently than fine detail." A strong focus on clarity and design principles also guided the development of Halo. Bungie's artists openly rejected realism, saying in a 2011 interview, quote, "Our games are never just a recreation of the physical world, and art direction plays the dominant role in the look of our games." It was the pursuit of good design, not realism, that created Halo's unmistakable visual identity. Its clean geometry, rich colors, and recognizable silhouettes made every weapon, vehicle, and alien immediately distinguishable in combat. Modern games often struggle with this balance. As technology improves, so does the temptation to fill every inch of the canvas with detail. But without restraint, many of those details just become excess noise. Low poly design reminds us that less isn't just cheaper or easier, it's often clearer. Of course, a lot of this simplicity wasn't intentional at first. It was born from something far more practical. In the late 90s and early 2000s, game developers weren't pursuing minimalism as an artistic choice, they were just fighting their hardware. Every polygon had a cost. Storage was limited, draw distances were short, and memory budgets were measured in kilobytes, not gigabytes. However, many developers were still eager to push the boundaries of what was possible with the technology available. Technical constraints may have forced them to rein in their scope at times, but it also focused their creativity. Before putting anything on screen, designers had to decide what mattered most, and in doing so, they created some of gaming's most iconic looks. Silent Hill is a great example of this. The PlayStation 1 couldn't render distant objects without severe pop-in, so the team used fog to hide the problem. To put it simply, the limited draw distance became fog, fog became mystery, and mystery became tension. What started as a technical workaround became the series' signature visual effect. Ico and Shadow of the Colossus are great examples too. Creator Fumito Ueda explained, quote, "If we don't have any limit to work from, it becomes hard to make anything good out of an idea." The technical constraints that prevented designers from putting more things on the screen actually helped them distill their artistic vision down into its purest and most potent form. So while you could describe Ico and Shadow of the Colossus as empty, a better description would be that they are overflowing with atmosphere, because their vast and quiet spaces feel sacred rather than barren. Or consider the sharp, blocky geometry of Tomb Raider. This wasn't a stylistic choice either, it was engineering necessity. The simplicity of Tomb Raider's environments offered clarity because every object had to be legible. You always knew where to jump, what to climb, and how far a gap was because the world was built with readability in mind. And we'll come back to readability in a moment. Other games like Resident Evil found clever ways to circumvent technical limitations. By fixing the camera and using pre-rendered backgrounds, developers could allocate more processing power to character models and lighting. The result was cinematic tension that set the standard for survival horror and remains one of the genre's best. Now, I highly recommend this video right here if you want to learn more about pre-rendered backgrounds on the PlayStation 1. In every case, limitation was actually the catalyst of creativity. And because every visual element had to serve a purpose, these worlds ultimately became more cohesive and engrossing than they might have been otherwise. Ironically, the limitations solved problems that modern games still struggle with. Today, many developers chase high-fidelity visuals at the expense of clarity. Developers seem fixated on dazzling us with dynamic lighting, real-time reflections, volumetric effects, and high-quality textures. And don't get me wrong, these things can be very impressive, but they can also be overwhelming and distracting. And this brings me back to readability. When visual information is reduced to the essentials, your brain focuses on what actually matters. In design terms, this is called readability, and it describes how quickly players can understand an environment or a situation from shape and color alone. Let's look at an example together. Take this still from the recent Halo Campaign Evolved reveal that shows the player engaging a jackal on the beach. Now compare this to the original game. I tried my best to recreate this shot. What do you notice? Which of these images is higher fidelity? Which is more readable? The issue here isn't that one image is readable and the other is not. They're both readable, but one is much more legible than the other due to clearly defined shapes, contrast, and rich colors. And I probably don't have to tell you which is which. The issue is still very noticeable in motion too. Take a look. Do you see the problem? Now, maybe you think this is just nostalgia talking, but even today, many games still adhere to these same timeless design principles, and that's because they work. Scroll through Steam and you'll see plenty of games that succeed despite not having ray tracing or whatever the current graphical trend is. Journey is a prime example from a few years ago. Much like Shadow of the Colossus, the absence of clutter is partly what makes its emotional beats land so hard. The game is more concerned with movement and mood, and that simplicity is what makes the experience timeless. Monument Valley, Superhot, Risk of Rain 2, Project Zomboid, BattleBit, Inside, and Untitled Goose Game are just a few standout titles on a growing list of contemporary hits that embrace the simplicity and minimalism of the 90s and early 2000s. These games aren't retro revivals or nostalgia bait. They've succeeded because they speak a universal visual language that transcends technological eras. And the proof is in the pudding. Even with modern hardware capable of overwhelming realism, many of the most memorable experiences are what you might call low fidelity. Speaking for myself, I'm much more excited about games like Pulsebreaker, Deep State, Compound Fracture, Beta Decay, Derelict, Phase Zero, and Darklight Survivor than most upcoming AAA releases. I mean, look at this and tell me it doesn't look awesome. And listen, I know not everybody buys into this whole less is more idea. Whenever low poly games are praised, inevitably some pushback surfaces, usually rooted in assumptions about what quote unquote good graphics should be. But many of these common objections fall apart under scrutiny. Some say high fidelity equals immersion. And on paper, realism might sound like the most logical choice for achieving immersion, but in practice, it can easily fracture immersion. When a hyper-detailed world includes just one bad animation or oddly lit object, the entire illusion collapses. The more realistic something tries to be, the more noticeable its flaws are. Low-poly visuals have an advantage by offering greater clarity and cohesion. With fewer details competing for your attention, you focus on mood, movement, and intention. Immersion isn't about simulating reality, it's about sustaining belief. And simplicity achieves that more reliably. Some say low poly appeal is just nostalgia. And look, I'll concede that nostalgia can amplify affection, but it can't create strong design. Modern successes like the ones I mentioned earlier resonate with gamers who never even touched a PlayStation 1, an N64, or an original Xbox. And that's because simplicity taps into the universal design principles we discussed earlier. Some say more detail means better art. This one is just false on its face. More polygons don't automatically create better aesthetics. As we discussed, without intentionality, details can quickly become clutter, and clutter can become noise. Strong art direction isn't just about what to include, it's also about what not to include so that the most important elements can shine. Low poly games naturally encourage this practice. I've even heard people lament older games have clunky controls and a low frame rate. And this one is true, but it's really not what we're talking about. Performance has little to do with art direction and design. And while I agree that you have to make some concessions when playing older titles, especially if you're playing them on original hardware, that's just part of the deal. But in cases where games have been updated and brought to newer systems, like the recent Tomb Raider Remastered collection, those concessions aren't present, which actually makes those old games hit even harder than before. None of these objections really hold up, and that's because restraint isn't a compromise. It's a design philosophy that continues to prove itself. That said, I will add one criticism that does hold up. The games I've mentioned so far are all standout titles that had superior art direction. For every Halo or Silent Hill, there are dozens of games from that era that were low poly but didn't have the same staying power. So, are low poly games better? Not necessarily. A game being low poly doesn't automatically make it good, obviously, but a low poly game with great design can absolutely be incredibly immersive and timeless. You don't need cutting edge graphics to create a memorable experience for players. And that's really the lesson here. Don't underestimate or write off games with simpler graphics. When you take a step back and look at the full picture, the appeal of low poly games makes perfect sense. Low poly aesthetics work because they focus your attention on what matters most: composition, mood, color, silhouette, and atmosphere. They let your brain handle the rest, which makes the experience more personal and memorable. The games we remember most vividly typically aren't the ones with the most impressive graphics. They're the ones that had strong art direction and allowed us to fill in the gaps ourselves. And that's exactly why those blocky, imperfect worlds persist in our memories longer than the most realistic games ever could. Those worlds endure because they left space for us to inhabit them. Guys, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making this. It's a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. So leave me a like if you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what's your favorite low poly game. And if you want to hear more from me in the future, subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.